then I'm the one that you were praying for that God would heal. John Boyd, when he asked me to preach, asked me if I would speak about that experience. So for the next few minutes, you need to charge this time to him. My time will come later. And what you're going to be seeing on the screen are pictures of two different backpacking trips that my wife and I took. One before my strokes, and then one 3 months after my strokes. And the reason I put them up there is for a couple of reasons. Two of the lessons that I learned from having the strokes and being blind for 3 days and not being able to talk were, one, to appreciate God's beauty in His creation every single day. And the other one was that if you allow fear and doubt to keep you from doing the things you want to do, then you'll not be living the life that God has prepared for you. And so when it came time for us to go on this 28-mile hike from the top of Yosemite at Tuolumne Meadows to the valley floor, 28 miles, we descended about 6,000 feet altogether. We had to ask ourselves, are we really going to do this? It was one thing to plan it. It was another thing to talk about it. And the closer the time came, the scarier it became to be that far away from help. So we decided that we would go somewhere we knew, somewhere where at least I knew Marcia could get help if something happened to me. She had not considered that. She said she was going to stay with me if something happened to me. She was going to go get help is what she was going to do if I had anything to say about it. But we went on our hike. I was able to go on the hike without any medication other than my blood thinner that I'm still on. And we finished the hike in 5 days this year instead of 4, but that's only because we found Merced Lake. And if you ever get a chance to go to Merced Lake, it's the big lake that you'll see the beautiful reflections on. It's about 14 miles from the valley floor. And so we spent 2 nights there, one resting and taking it easy. The story begins about my strokes with me setting a goal to be able to run 10 miles and enjoy it, which is 2 different things, being able to run 10 miles without stopping and enjoying it while you're doing it. I decided that I was going to give myself a year to do that. So I started off slowly. By June, I was up to 6 miles, and I was averaging 9 minutes a mile, and I know if there are youngsters in here, they think, that's practically walking. But for me, 6 miles at 9 minutes a mile was a good pace. And then we went on a 6,000-mile road trip in our car. I made it to Arkansas, and I went to run in Arkansas, which is at sea level, and I had been training at my house at 4,000 feet. And I got to the 2nd mile mark, and I had to stop. I was out of breath. I could not figure out what was going on, and I ended up walking home, because every time I would try to run again, I'd get out of breath. So I would have to stop. So I didn't know what to think, went on with our trip. Then when we got to Washington, D.C. to see our daughter Janine, we were walking around Washington, D.C., and I joked with Marcia and Janine that they needed to slow down because I was getting a blood clot in my leg. I'm not allowed to say things like that anymore. I probably was getting a blood clot in my leg. I'm not sure at that point if I was. But I did get a blood clot, evidently, that went to my lungs sometime during that trip. When I got home, I started experiencing long bouts of AFib. And if you don't know what AFib feels like, it feels like a heart flutter, but heart flutters just kind of happen for a second and then they go away. With the AFib, it happened for a second and then it kept going and kept going and kept going. And so when you have AFib and your heart feels funny, the first thing you want to do is check your pulse. You don't have one. That was a scary thing for me. being stubborn and not really liking doctors when I had been running and now I can't run very far, and I'm having heart flutters, and I feel my pulse in my wrist and I can't find it. I decided that maybe it was the right time to call a doctor. So we called a cardiologist. I also took my blood pressure, and it was something ridiculous like 85/40. Because what's happening is your heart is doing an extra beat. And when it does the extra beat, it doesn't allow the blood to exit your heart. It just kind of sits there. So a very little blood leaves your heart, even though it's beating faster than it's supposed to be beating. So I'm on the couch doing my favorite activity that summer after the vacation, resting, and this started happening. So Marcia called my cardiologist that I'd already seen. The problem with AFib, if it goes on for a long period of time, of course, is that your blood tends to pool, and when your blood pools, it clots, and when it clots, you get problems. So the first thing my cardiologist did was put me on a blood thinner, which was the right course of action. I got put on a blood thinner. The AFib was still happening, but at least now I didn't have to worry about blood clots, so I didn't have to worry about strokes or going to my lungs. After a while, the shortness of breath I was experiencing went away, and the doctor continued to put me on one medication after another, trying to get my AFib to stop. He also had me do all kinds of tests, CAT scans, treadmill tests. At the time, I didn't realize that running the half mile he had me do on the stress test, even though it went uphill, wasn't long enough to trigger the AFib, that I had to run farther than that in order to get the AFib. So I passed all the tests. He couldn't find anything. He could not recreate the situations that made the AFib happen. So he kept changing my meds or putting me on a stronger and stronger med. And finally, when I was running with my Garmin on, and I got to that magical 2-mile mark, and my heart rate went from 140 to 199, maxed out my Garmin, and I had to stop running. I decided we have to try something else. So I called the doctor, and he put me on high blood pressure medicine. The reason he didn't put me on a high blood pressure medicine earlier is because one of the side effects is it slows your heart rate down. So having run quite a bit, my resting heart rate was already in the 60s. He put me on the high blood pressure medicine. That fixed the AFib. Everything was wonderful, no more attacks. You would think everything was fine. But he also put me on a monitor, and he monitored my heart rate while I was sleeping, and it was in the 30s. So that created its own problem. Now we're back to blood clots while I'm sleeping because the medicine is making my heart beat too slowly. So he told me, I'm medicating you into a pacemaker. And if I keep treating you the way I'm treating you, you're going to have a pacemaker. And being a young 54-year-old person, I didn't think I wanted a pacemaker. So he said, there is a procedure that you can have that will stop your AFib. So of course, pacemaker for the rest of my life, procedure. It didn't take me long to decide I want to have the procedure. So he told me, I'm a plumber, you need to see an electrician. So he's an expert of the plumbing of the heart, the beating, the arteries, all of that part of my heart was fine. I needed to see someone who controlled AFib and the electrical impulses of my heart. My particular problem was being caused by the veins exiting my heart. They were triggering extra beats by sending out electrical impulses. So he was going to go in through the veins in my leg, stick 2 tubes up, go inside those veins, expand a balloon, freeze those cells that were causing the charges, and do all 4 veins if he could get to them, and then pull the little tubes or whatever he stuck in my veins out, and everything would be fine. So that was our plan, that I was going to go and have that procedure done on March 13th, a Friday. And I'd only met with Dr. K that one time before I knew him, but I trusted him. I trusted that was what God wanted me to do, and prayed about it, and of course my wife prayed with me about it. And the reason I rushed it is my 35th anniversary was coming up, and no one wants to be laid up on their 35th anniversary. We had plans to do something. We just weren't sure what at that point. So we scheduled it for the 13th. Marcia and I are both teachers. We ordered our subs. We told everyone on staff, we're not going to be here on Friday. I'm having this procedure. They had been concerned about me from the beginning of the year because of the shortness of the breath that I had and the blood clot that I had at the beginning of the school year. So they, of course, all told me that they would be praying for me on Friday. So Wednesday comes along, I go off my blood thinners like I'm supposed to. I stop taking my meds on Thursday like I'm supposed to. I don't eat or drink anything starting at 9 o'clock, and I love midnight snacks. So that was my hardest thing. So if you can't have a midnight snack and you can't drink anything after 9 o'clock, what do? You go to bed early. So I went to bed early. And this gets to the part of the story where you're just going to have to believe me. And you can come to your own conclusions about this. I'm just going to tell you what happened. I went to bed early, 9:30. I don't know what time Marcia joined me. I was sound asleep Thursday night, the night before my scheduled procedure, and I heard a voice. It was a woman's voice, a young woman's voice, calling my name. Randy, Randy. I heard it. I don't know where it came from. You can decide where it came from. I heard the voice. Just like you, when you wake up from a bad dream and you're sound asleep one second and wide awake the next, I was wide awake. I looked over at Marcia. She was on her stomach, sound asleep. I knew it wasn't her. Not a minute later, my cell phone rang. I use it as my alarm clock. It sits on the nightstand next to my bed. It was 1:10 in the morning. My cell phone rang. It was my cardiologist. He was driving from Beverly Hills, where he lives, to Irvine, where his wife was visiting family. His wife had had a tubular pregnancy, and it ruptured, and she was hemorrhaging. And she told the doctors in Irvine, "You're not operating on me until my husband gets here." So obviously it was a very frantic drive. I've never asked him what kind of car he has, but he told me he was not obeying the rules of the road that night. So he told me during this conversation that if I wanted, he would get somebody else to do the procedure the next day, because I had already gone off my meds and I'd already done everything and been prepared. And I told him not to worry about it. We would just reschedule. That would be a lot easier. I, after all, trusted him, even though I'd only seen him once. So I said, we'll just reschedule. Don't worry about me. You worry about taking care of your wife. And then I said something that kind of surprised me, because I don't normally say this to strangers. I said, my wife and I will say a prayer for you and your wife right now. So I hung up, and we did. And then I got up to use the restroom, and while I was in the restroom, I realized that the phone call didn't bother me. It was the voice that bothered me. I could not explain what that voice was. All I know is I went from sound asleep to hearing my name to my phone ringing that quickly. And then later, when I talked to the doctor about the voice, he told me, well, I thought you were alert for that time of night. I just assumed you were having a hard time going to sleep because I was worried about my procedure the next day. But that is how Dr. K and I started discussing prayer, is through his wife. So of course, I woke up the next morning and Marcia and I didn't need a sub. So I called the sub line, canceled our subs, and we went to work. And I rescheduled the subs later that week for the next Friday. So we show up at work. I've already notified my principal. First thing my principal said was, oh, I'm sorry that happened to you, but I'll be praying for the doctor's wife. Every person that saw us, of course, knew that I was having a heart procedure that day, and wanted to know why I was at school. So we explained it to them, and almost to a person, they all said the same thing. I'll stop praying for you then, and I'll start praying for the doctor's wife. So I couldn't wait past lunch. I texted my doctor, because I now had his cell phone, because he called me in the middle of the night. I texted him and said, I went back on my meds this morning. I'm going to reschedule. How is your wife? Marcia and I and my entire school staff have been praying for her. I don't know what to expect from this doctor. What would you think if you text that to your doctor, what kind of reply you would get? But anyways, he texted me back, thank you so much for the prayers. She is doing better, but she's still not well. She's still seriously ill. So I went ahead and rescheduled my surgery. Same thing happened the next week. I went off my meds on Wednesday, or went off my blood thinner on Wednesday, went off my meds on Thursday, didn't eat, and went to Cedars-Sinai to have my procedure. Now, because my procedures were postponed, my two daughters were in town. The one who lives in Washington, D.C., was coming in for her baby shower that weekend. She told me, Dad, men are invited. You have to go. I told her, but I could find something else to do. No, you have to be there. So I was going to attend my first baby shower, but I got out of that one. My other daughter was coming in for her spring break from Tulsa, Oklahoma. She is getting married in January. So this was her first chance to make wedding arrangements. And of course, she wanted my help. I got out of that one too. But they were both here for the procedure. Actually, they got there the night after the procedure on Friday night. But they were here. Had I had my procedure on the 13th, they wouldn't have been here. But because it was God's timing and it happened on the 20th, they were both in town when I had my procedure. Let's see where I am. Oh, and by the way, when I talk about me being wide awake, you need something to compare it to. So I'm going to tell you about what happened while I was in college. Mrs. Oler was working a swing shift. She got home about 10 o'clock. I met her at the front door, and I asked her if she parked the bus okay. It sounds like a fine question if your wife is a bus driver. Makes sense. She's a waitress. Didn't make any sense. I insisted that she answered me before I went to bed because I needed to know if she parked the bus okay. So finally, in exasperation, she just said, yes, I parked the bus okay. And I went back to bed. Okay? That's how sound I normally sleep. You can't wake me up. I slept through earthquakes. I've slept through everything. So for that voice to wake me up that night was very, very unusual. But again, that was God's planning and not mine. But our plans were to go to Cedars-Sinai on Friday morning, have the procedure. The doctor said I'd be done in an hour or so. I'd be going over to recovery to spend a couple hours so they could watch me, and then I'd get my own room. I went, phew, never been in the hospital before. You're making me stay here. I'm glad I get my own room. And Marcia was going to get to sleep in a cot in my room. So it was perfect. I had everything I needed. I had my own room, I had my wife, I could watch TV, enjoy myself, everything was great. And I was going to get up Saturday morning and go home. That was the plan. Well, God had different plans. And I'm not saying God caused my strokes, but God had a plan to deal with my strokes that I knew nothing about. During the procedure, while hooked up to all the sensors, I had them everywhere. I had more wires on me that day than a Model T car does. And my doctor was watching my heart as he was starting to do the procedure, And he noticed that in the other side of my heart, my valve began to flutter. And because that valve started fluttering, he watched that happen, and then he watched the AFib happen. So during my procedure, he discovered the cause of my AFib, because he had me all hooked up, and the timing was just perfect for him to discover the cause of my AFib. Once again, God's timing, not our timing. So he fixed them both. He fixed my heart flutter, and he fixed my AFib. So why have one procedure when you can have two? So I got two procedures for the price of one. But it was during that time, when he restarted my heart, that two blood clots went from my heart to my brain. And one of them went into my cognitive speech area of my brain, and the other one went into my visual cortex. So I had two parts of my brain that were now starved of oxygen and died, and were soon going to send more oxygen around them, which makes them swell, which makes your symptoms worse. So I'm having the procedure, he's finished, he wakes me up, he asks me to do all the move your right arm, move your left arm. Evidently I could do everything he asked me to do. He would ask me questions and I would answer with mm-hmm and mm-mm. Those were the things I could say. He told me later, he just thought I was a man of few words. Two, mm-hmm and mm-mm. And that's all I would say to him. But I could do everything he said. So the typical stroke things that doctors look for weren't there. I could move all my hands, my face muscles worked properly. Everything that he checked was fine, except I couldn't talk to him. But he didn't realize that I couldn't talk to him. So he sent me to recovery, came out, explained to Marcia that I was fine, explained to her about the heart flutter and how he had fixed that, how he had fixed the AFib, and that was fine, and that she could come in and see me in a few minutes. So during those few minutes, Marcia decided to call her parents. So she called her mom and dad in hospice, where her dad had been fighting with prostate cancer for 3 years, and he was near the end. She called and told them that the procedures went well, that I was okay. And then Marcia's mom told Marcia's dad, and 15 minutes after that phone call, Marcia's dad passed away. He had waited until he found out that I was going to be okay. They didn't know about the strokes, so they didn't lie to him. They told him the truth at that moment, and then he passed away. Once again, God's timing, not ours. And by the way, Marcia had told me Friday, before they knew I had strokes, that her father passed away. She said she suspected something was wrong, even though all I wanted to do was sleep when I didn't respond. But I heard her, and I could understand what was going on in the room around me, but I couldn't speak. So when she told me, all I could do was listen. It was like I was in one world and they were in another. And so the next day she said, "Randy, do you remember what I said to you about my father yesterday?" And I still couldn't speak, but I could say, mm-hmm. And that's all that she got from me. That's all the comfort that I could give at that time. But even though I'd had 2 strokes, I knew that her father had passed away. Let's see. I told you where the 2 strokes were. I told you that about being in the 2 different worlds. What they meant was that I had a terrible headache. Not all stroke victims get terrible headaches, but I had a terrible headache. The only way I could relieve my headache was by rubbing my head. So, of course, when I woke up, I would rub my head. I'd put myself back to sleep, rubbing my head, and I'd go to sleep, and I'd wake back up, and I'd rub my head some more. Marcia said I rubbed my face so hard that my nose was bruised and red, and my forehead was bruised. That's all I could do to relieve the pain. My vision was limited to about what you can see in a circle if you hold your hand up, which meant my left eye was not working at all. My right eye, if I looked forward, I could see forward, but I couldn't see down, and I couldn't see to the sides, and I couldn't see up. So if I looked down, I could see the ground, but I couldn't see where I was going. So it was not an easy task to move about. But because I could see through that little circle, when someone talked to me, I could look at them, and my eyes tracked. So all the signs that they were looking for weren't there. As far as they could tell, I was normal. And of course, I couldn't tell them what was wrong with me. So as it went on, they figured things out. My daughter watched my face when Marcia turned the lights on, because she wanted me awake. So she wanted the lights on and the windows open. But my daughter watched my face and realized that the light hurt my eyes. And so she said, "Mom, that's hurting Dad's eyes, shut the blinds." So she shut the blinds and turned the light back down low. And then later my daughter asked me, "Dad, is this headache worse than any headache you've ever had?" And because she asked me the question, I could say, "Mm-hmm." And that's how they knew I had a headache. One of the good things about strokes is you don't realize how dire your situation is. So when they were asking me questions and I couldn't answer them, like, "Do you know what this is?" And I could say, "Mm-hmm." And then they'd say, "What is it?" And they were pointing to their watch. I couldn't name it. So I'd say, "Don't know." That's all I could say. "Don't know," and I would smile. I remember smiling, thinking it's funny that I couldn't remember what a watch was. They'd hold up a pen and say the same thing. "Do you know what this is?" "Mm-hmm." "What is it?" The words would not come. "Don't know." That's all I could answer. But the thing about having the stroke is you don't know what you don't know. So I didn't realize that I couldn't speak and that was causing a problem. I didn't realize that I couldn't see and that was a problem. And to make matters worse, I thought that somehow Marcia knew those things. Yeah, that was the strangest thing. I thought that somehow she was in my brain and she realized that I couldn't see and I couldn't speak. But of course, she's wondering why I won't wake up and why I won't talk to them. So finally, Saturday morning, after they said, "Well, he's just tired, let him sleep," a nurse came in. She was a nurse from the neurology ward who was covering for a cardiologist nurse. And if you don't know the difference, cardiologists study your heart, that's where I was. Neurologists study your brains. She saw me and said, "There's something wrong." So she started running me through little stroke tests that I couldn't do. So she went and got one of her other neurologist nurses, and she came and evaluated me and said, "You're right, there's something wrong." So they called my doctors back in, and Marcia knows all the details better than I do, but they started to be worried because now it was Saturday morning. I'm supposed to be awake and doing things, eating. And they brought in some neurologists to check me out. So the first thing the neurologist wanted to do was go give me a CAT scan to make sure that I didn't have bleeding on the brain. But they knew that I had had a stroke. A stroke doctor came in, asked me some questions. Evidently, the only color I could identify was yellow, which means nothing to you or I, but it meant something to them. So he knew something about one part of my brain because I could identify yellow and nothing else. And they decided they needed to start the testing. So it was Saturday morning that they actually realized something was wrong. And I've had people tell me, "Oh, because you were in the hospital, they gave you stroke medicine, and that's why you got better so quickly." They didn't. They didn't know I had a stroke, so they didn't give me the stroke medicine. The first medicine I got was from Marcia at dinner time, and they were just my blood thinners and my other heart medications that I had taken. But during that time where the doctors were evaluating me, getting me ready to go down and do the MRI, I needed to use the restroom. And this is where Marcia didn't realize I couldn't see. So I couldn't get up by myself, so Marcia got on one arm, and the nurse got on the other arm, thankfully a male nurse, and they were going to take me to the restroom. So they start helping me walk, not realizing that they need to be leading me to the bathroom because I can't see. So I'm walking, looking down, and the only thing I can see are my feet, trying to get to the bathroom with two people helping me. And I get to a wall, they stop. They're in charge, they're leading me to the bathroom, so I think I'm in the bathroom. Fortunately, Marcia stopped me and said, "What are you doing?" So they led me to the bathroom, and that was my first two-word phrase that I could say, "Can't see." And so that let my doctors know that I was having major problems seeing. So they ordered the test. Dr. K, my cardiologist who had done the test, came back to the hospital extremely concerned, just as concerned about me as he had been about his wife the week before. He was a nervous wreck, according to Marcia and the rest of my family members. Finally, the nurses told him, "Dr. K, go to the chapel. We'll call you when we know something, when the tests are done," because he was pacing back and forth, a nervous wreck. And so finally he went to the chapel. He spent the entire day Saturday in the chapel praying for me. It's pretty dedicated physician that will do that. So Dr. K came, the neurology doctors took over, they started doing tests, MRI, or the CAT scan was a piece of cake, no bleeding, I was fine, I was in and out of consciousness, I knew what was going on, they were doing tests. That one was no problem. Then they did the 3.5-hour MRI test. If you've ever had an MRI done, they like you to stay on your back. The problem with me is on my back, my head hurt. I didn't like being on my back. The only way to get my head to stop hurting when I was on my back was to rub my head. That's a problem in an MRI machine. They don't like you to do that. The other thing is, they're very, very loud, even with earplugs in. So I have a pounding headache, and now I'm in a machine for 3 hours that's pounding noise. I was not real cooperative, not on purpose. All I knew is I had to rub my head. So they started by scolding me. It didn't work. They then pulled me out and packed my head with towels, put me back in. Still didn't work. They strapped my arms down so I couldn't rub my head any longer. Still didn't work. They finally pulled me out, took tape, Marcia said, and taped over this way, taped my entire skull down so I couldn't move if I wanted to, and had my hands down. And then they said, "You're going to need to come over by his legs and pat him on the legs and comfort him and tell him not to move." So finally, they got the 3.5-hour test done by basically strapping me down, and they didn't want to sedate me because of the fear from the brain injuries. And it was this time that Marcia said she finally surrendered to Jesus in prayer. I don't know what that means. You can ask her. But finally, I got out of that experience. That was the worst experience of the whole thing for me, waking up, having a headache, and not being able to deal with it. I got out of the test. They found out, of course, I had 2 strokes. They were getting ready to come in and show the MRI results to my daughters and my family. And Marcia went to go grab a bite to eat real fast, and my 2 daughters and my daughter's fiance, was in the room, and Janine, my 6-month pregnant daughter, was sitting on my bed. There weren't a lot of chairs. She was sitting on my bed, the one comfortable place, kicking her leg, which is no big deal unless your head is pounding. And when your head is pounding and someone's kicking their leg on your bed, it hurts. So I mustered up all the words I could say, "Get off." And I can remember her saying to me, "Dad, you're going to make your 6-month pregnant daughter get off your bed?" And these are the words that I said to her, and she said, "As soon as you said them, Dad, I knew you were in there." I said, "Too bad, sucker." And she knew my sense of humor, and she said, "I knew you were in there." Those are the best things I could say to her at that point.